Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's presentation, Sales and Operation Planning, S&OP, a journey from chaos to prosperity. My name is Matt Lowell. I'm a staff writer for Industry Week. Industry Week is producing today's event, and it is sponsored by Demand Solutions. Before we get going, a few quick housekeeping things. At Industry Week here, our mission is to advance the business of manufacturing. The Industry Week staff is dedicated to working with you to identify and share the trends, the strategies, the technologies, the best practices that will help you build more innovative, more competitive, and more profitable businesses. Now, as part of this webinar, if you have it up on your screen, we will have a live Q&A session. That will be at the end of the hour. We'll be accepting questions throughout the session today to improve the chances of your question being addressed. Do not wait until the end of the event to submit them. Ask them as they occur to you. Type them in just as soon as they pop in your head. There are more than 800 registrants today from close to 40 countries. Questions will be coming in throughout the hour, so please, if you do have a question, do not wait. We'll attempt to address all questions, although, again, with those numbers, it might be tough to get to all of them, and there might be some overlap among some of you. You might have the same questions, so do keep that in mind. Before I introduce today's speaker, there are a few other things that I'd like to review. This webinar will be available on demand in the next couple of days on industryweek.com, also iw.com, all leads to the same site. To access it, use the same login information that you used for the live webinar today that you just used a couple minutes ago. We'll also send out a post-event email reminding you about that on-demand version. We ask right now that you please disable all pop-up blockers. If you're using Internet Explorer, you can disable the pop-up blocker by going into the Tools menu, click on Internet Options, choose the Privacy tab at the top. Tools, Internet Options, Privacy tab. Looking at the bottom of your screen, you'll see that widget bar, blue and white font. Those icons will allow you to open and close windows on your screen as you wish. The first few widgets automatically opened when you entered this webinar. They include the slide area, the audio controls, speaker information, Q&A box. Again, just type in the questions as they come to you. Next, the blue icons. Those are your opportunities to get social on this. The webinar today allows you to take full advantage of all social networking. So share your thoughts with your LinkedIn community, send tweets out to your Twitter followers, post comments on Facebook, or just send an email to a friend. Old school social networking. The last few icons are other tools you may wish to use. Use the resource list icon. You can download a copy of today's slides as a PDF. You can also save or print them. The red checkmark button there launches a survey that we do ask you to please complete at the end of the presentation. Just takes a couple minutes. The yellow question mark button brings up a series of troubleshooting tips. Also, this webinar allows you to have it whatever way you want. You can customize your webcast console. You can make the title bar, move that around to move windows. You can minimize a window. You can maximize it, have it fill up the entire screen, whatever you want, whatever you're most comfortable with on your monitor. And finally, if the slides stop advancing at any time for you, if you have any technical difficulties, if you're having any problems with audio, first, try to press the F5 key. That'll refresh the webinar console on your screen. If you are still having problems, just send in a question. We will try to get that fixed for you as soon as we can. All that said, let's start today's webinar. Today's presenter, Bill Whiteside. He is a principal from Demand Solutions Northeast. He has experience in S&OP from multiple angles over a good, healthy number of years. Bill, floor is all yours.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate that kind introduction and your diplomatic way of saying I'm old. I've been at this for a while. And thank you, everyone, for participating. As Matt mentioned, the audience is overwhelming, quite gratifying. More than 800 people have registered from, I think it's 39 countries. So that says a lot about just the interest in this topic of sales and operations planning. In putting this proposal together, even in naming it, I was really particular about every word I chose. Certainly, the chaos will come through when I talk about some of my experience as a practitioner of S&OP. And also I'll share how I was able to apply some hard-won lessons and what we learned during the process to help guide our company to at least a relative level of prosperity. And also, even the word journey is important because in a lot of ways, this was a very personal journey for me. And any journey has a starting point. And this specific journey started here especially those of you who are on the call in the States recognize this as a Costco, one of the big box stores, and they're all over in the U.S. There are close to 700 Costcos, and they're in a handful of countries around the world. But the journey for me actually started at this particular Costco. It's a place that's near and dear to my heart. It's like a lot of other Costcos in that there are just rows and rows of large volume products at pretty good prices. Like any other Costco, and really like most retail stores in general, there's special parking the closer you get to the store. And this is kind of rare to have any open parking spaces, but the handicap spots for people with disabilities are almost closest to the store. One thing that makes this particular Costco kind of unique, though, is even closer than the handicap spots are parking spots for horse and buggies. This particular Costco is in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is my hometown. I shop at this store. I'm still enamored with the Amish, with their culture after about 30 years of living here. But what really makes this Costco and this start in the journey really special for me is before they were able to build this Costco, or in order to build this Costco, they had to tear this place down. This is what sat on that ground until about 15 years ago when they built the Costco. This is a plant, a manufacturing site. It's a dairy. It's where we manufactured ice cream. Tanker trucks would come in one end in the back. Freezer trucks would leave the other end with ice cream after processing the milk that came in the tanker trucks. And it's where I was an avid participant in a very chaotic environment. It's where I learned about sales and operations planning. And during the course of this webinar, in the next 45 minutes or so, I'll share some of my experiences and, more important, the lessons that I learned during those experiences. I wanted to start with a common starting point and get to a common definition of what exactly sales and operations planning is. I know what it is, but that's my definition. And very often when we talk to different people, different managers, and we ask, okay, when you talk about sales and operations planning, what do you mean? And very often they'll describe their process, and it's an S process. There's a focus on sales without a lot of attention paid to operations, to inventories, and to capacities. Once in a while, someone will give us feedback that the process of their company is more of an O process. They're really focusing on the operations and efficiencies and not so much on sales. So for the purpose of the webinar, for common communication, I wanted to see if we could come up with a common definition. So I started where a lot of us started. I opened up Google and typed in, what is sales and operations planning? And the first thing that came back is that there's a lot of interest in it. There were 23,400,000 results for that specific question. Not necessarily that many different definitions, but a lot of different points of view about what sales and operations planning really is. And then the first result that came back, it showed the result, it showed the link, and then it provided a brief synopsis of what the definition of sales and operations planning is, or at least the most prominent in terms of search engine optimization in Google. And you don't have to read that whole synopsis, but what was kind of interesting was it said, well, it's a process that helps a company achieve focus, alignment, and synchronization among all functions of the organization, which is nice to hear. It's kind of like wishing for world peace or hoping that the Kardashians would just go away. It's a worthy aspiration, but it doesn't help a lot in terms of getting to your ultimate goal. So wanted to do some additional digging, and you'll see that in just a little bit. But one other thing jumped out at me pretty quickly when I saw that top response, in that it mentioned that S&OP was developed by Dick Wing, who worked at the time for the Oliver White Company. And I know Dick. He's a guy I worked with for a number of years. He actually helped our company develop our sales and operations planning software. He shared a lot of his information with me and with others through the years. I touched base with him recently and also got his okay to share some of his ideas during the course of this webinar. So I learned a lot from him. He was a pioneer, and all of his ideas are still very lively today. He's actually the guy who literally wrote the book on sales and operations planning. We'll talk towards the end of the webinar about multiple resources that we can point you to, and this is one of the best. His book, Orchestrating Success, still resonates, still provides a great roadmap for launching or fine-tuning any company's sales and operations planning process. But I wanted to get into more detail than that high-level Wikipedia definition of S&OP, so I went to another great resource. APEX, a lot of you are familiar with or probably members of. It's the American, and it's a global organization, the Production and Inventory Control Society. And they have a dictionary that defines just about any aspect of planning, supply chain planning, forecasting, S&OP. They used to have a simpler definition of S&OP, but here's where they are today. I'm certainly not going to read this entire block, but there are 3 segments that I think are worth emphasizing. First of all, it's a process that brings together all of the plans for a business. That includes sales, marketing, development, manufacturing, sourcing, and financial into one integrated set of plans. And very often in companies that don't have a vibrant S&OP process, there's planning going on in those areas, but it tends to be siloed. And a big part of S&OP is a breaking down of those silos. And then they add, it's performed at least once a month and is reviewed by management at an aggregate or product family level. And that's important. If some companies have weekly calls with their customers, which is great. It's phenomenal input, but that's not necessarily S&OP. If you're doing S&OP more than once a month, you're probably not doing it right. It's just hard to find the time to do it more than once a month in the detail that you need. And it's also very important to focus at a manageable level of detail, which is typically at a product group or product family level. And certainly the product family definitions will vary from business to business, from company to company. And then the last thing in that definition, the process must reconcile all supply, demand, and new product plans with both the detail and the aggregate levels and tied to the business plan. That reconciliation is relatively new, and it's a part of IBP. Integrated Business Planning is a more and more popular term these days. We'll talk about that a little bit further during this webinar, but that level of integration really helps the S&OP process resonate through the organization, through the products that you plan. And then one last example of a definition. To a lot of people, sales and operations planning is this. It's the data. It's the presentation of the data. And this is one example of how you can organize and present your data. But the basic idea here is to take all of your forecasting and budget supply planning data, which could be manufactured data, where more and more companies are sourcing products, so it could be outsourced products, and look at the impact of that on the inventory. And it's not just a static presentation of the data. Ideally, you're able to do scenario plannings, do what if, and look at the implications of things like changes on the forecast, or what happens if we're running into a capacity constraint, and at the end of the day, make a better decision based on that input, based on that data. So in order to get started, this is a real high-level view of some of the things you'll need. Certainly the process is important. I'm in business to sell software, but even I'll admit that the process, especially for S&OP, is a lot more important than the software. It's having the discipline to gather the appropriate information, to review it objectively, to collaborate with your peers, to bring all the right people into the process, and to make intelligent decisions. Data, obviously, is critical too. And companies often underestimate just what the data requirements are for a real good S&OP process. You typically have to pull data in from other systems. You may have a forecasting application, a budget might exist in a file cabinet somewhere, your supply plans may come from your ERP system. So it's important to be able to gather the data at the appropriate levels of detail, and software certainly helps with that. A lot of us, including me, start with spreadsheets, and that's a great way to start the process, to prove the concept. But the maintenance of the data, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail a little bit later, is often the breaking point for unsuccessful S&OP processes. And then there are the 3 C's, commitment, collaboration, and communication. And that requires commitment not just from you, if you're the person responsible for running your company's S&OP process. Senior management commitment is also critically important. People have to know that top management is behind the process, that non-participation is not an option, and that they're expected to participate and refine the process going forward. And that will include collaboration with your peers. It will involve people from operations, finance, marketing, purchasing, and the communication of your results, of uncertainty, of plans for the future. That's also a big part of what makes this work. In terms of the data, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but this is an introduction of the kinds of data that you'll need. And this should be time phase data, ideally monthly data. So you'll want forecasts going out at least the next 12 months, ideally 24 months, sometimes even 36 months. Budgets for that same time period. Supply plans, which again, if you're a manufacturer, it would be your production plans or your manufacturing plans. If you're importing products, it would be your sourcing plans. And then tying all that together into an inventory plan and seeing the impact of changes in the forecast and supply plans and inventories, and then also, especially for manufacturers, the impact of that on capacities. But also, some companies also take into account storage capacity as well. What's the impact of changes in the plan and what we're going to have to stock in our own warehouse or maybe third-party warehouses. When you tie that all together, it's incredible, just the value that perspective adds to your planning and your decision-making processes. And here's just an example of that. I've been in situations where I've been presented with a forecast, and I'll be given a spreadsheet with a row or a column of numbers and asked, well, what do you think? And in the vacuum, the forecast is completely meaningless. But when you start to add perspective, a very simple perspective, well, what did we sell for this product or this product family for the same period last year? All of a sudden, the forecast makes sense. Or maybe in some instances, it doesn't make sense, but at least it's justifiable. And then when you add additional perspective as part of the S&OP process, and you see, for example, well, how does that forecast compare with not just last year's actual, but the budget? And maybe the budget, or in most cases, the budget will be fixed for the year, but maybe we're updating a latest estimate every month or maybe every quarter. And maybe let's take a look at that against the perspective of the orders that are coming in. And then this is all sales or demand-oriented information. Let's also take a look at the implications for supply. What are we planning to make? What had we planned to make? What's the impact of all this on the inventory? When you see all of this on one report, or better yet, on one interactive screen, and can do what is, can run different scenarios, this allows you to certainly plan more objectively and make better decisions with your planning data. And when you boil all this down, a big part of what we're doing is a reconciliation of your demand plans and your supply plans. And years ago, one of the first lessons I learned from Dick Ling, the father of S&OP, was this simple basic formula for the operation of a company. And he boiled it down to demand is going to equal supply over time, or it should equal supply over time. And a way of getting a sense of that very visually is supply, or in this case, supply capacity, is constrained to some degree. And usually in the real world, you have more flexibility here. There may be some variations from month to month or from period to period, but there is some finite limit to your capacity, your ability to supply products. On the other hand, our sales are going to be a lot more volatile. I've never worked with a business that doesn't have some degree of seasonality. Sometimes it's generic. I mean, certainly ice cream is a very seasonal business, and sometimes it's self-inflicted based on trade shows, sales events, other activity. So the challenge is, how do we fit that very seasonal demand pattern into our constrained ability to supply product? Well, obviously, you can't make any more than your capacity in a given period. So you need to have visibility into where you're in trouble in terms of capacity. And then, again, a bit of an oversimplification. To do this well, you may consider an advanced planning and scheduling tool, but you want to plan your supply earlier to make sure that you have the inventory in place in order to meet that seasonal demand. And I know that's pretty basic thinking. Some other options for handling seasonal demand or spikes in demand and limits in capacity, the inventory is one. You can carry the inventory early. Many companies do have the ability to flex their capacity. You might be able to add a shift. You might be able to add overtime. Sometimes, especially when you collaborate well with customers, you may be able to vary your lead time to some of your best customers. They're understanding that you can space and order out over time. Those who collaborate exceptionally well are able to actually manage demand, have an impact on what the customers are buying, when they're going to buy, and more often than not, the best strategy is some combination of the bullet points towards the top. And every once in a while, as painful as this can be, it makes sense to pass on a new sales opportunity. As a sales guy, as a marketing person, it really hurts to do that, but your existing customers shouldn't suffer based on an exciting new business opportunity. And the nice thing about sales and operations planning is that perspective it provides. It shows you the impact of, hey, if we do accept this order, what's it going to do to our inventories? What's this going to do to our ability to serve our other customers? I promised you chaos, so let me deliver on that promise and go back to my days as an S&OP practitioner. And that building I showed in the black and white picture was a company called Penn Dairies. It's here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I tell people I worked at a dairy in Lancaster, and for those in the States, they say, oh, you must work at Turkey Hill. It wasn't them. They were bigger than us. They survived longer than us. This dairy, unfortunately, was sold several years ago, and then the brands were put out of business. But it's especially unfortunate because this would have been the 125th anniversary of the company. We were started 125 years ago, a local company in Lancaster. When I started there as director of marketing, this wasn't the wagon, but there was another antique milk wagon just rotting behind the plant. And I wanted to use it in a TV commercial, and I actually worked with an Amish buggy maker to restore it, which that whole experience could be a webinar in itself. But our local heritage was and is very important. We're very active in the community, did fundraisers for the local library, had a free ice cream day, had really good quality products. It certainly wasn't up to Ben & Jerry's standards or Haagen-Dazs standards, but it was better than the store brand ice cream, and we made a lot of that too. We did a lot of, in addition to our own branded products, we did a lot of private label. So quite a diversity of product going through the plant, a rich tradition of history, of product quality. But unfortunately, one other really unfortunate tradition was we had a tendency to run out of ice cream every summer, which the end result of that is we were losing money in what should have been our Christmas every year. It's something that shouldn't have happened, but it was a result of unaccountable planning, some foolish planning, and I'll give you a sense of just how that happened. The seasonality of the ice cream business is probably pretty intuitive. We're at least in the U.S., and this hemisphere, we're getting into the summer months, the warmer months, and with warm weather comes ice cream consumption. So June and July in our world were the big months for ice cream. May is also a pretty big month for ice cream. So these stacked ice cream cones will give you a sense of the seasonal profile for the ice cream industry. Our capacity was below our sales capabilities. So our sales in June and July, and for the most part in May, were above capacity. So if we were really paying attention to this, if we were planning proactively, we would have done a better job of building our inventory well in advance of those peak selling seasons. Instead, what we did year in, year out, we started too late. The blue line on the graph shows our typical annual production, and we would only start to ramp up our production in March and then get to full capacity in April. I think we were doing a good job, but year in, year out, we started too late. We're also under pressure because we had built more inventory than the owner of this family-run business was comfortable with, so there was pressure to cut back. And the end result was chaos in the summer. We'd be running out of product. We'd be running on weekends, trying to catch up, running at exorbitant overtime just to maintain some customer service, even begging some competitors to co-pack product for us. So we knew we had to do something smarter. We had to do something better. But also part of the chaos was just I'll call it a process, but it was really the lack of a process that we had. Talk about fantasy forecast, and I was the person responsible for that. I had never done forecasting before in my life. It had never been in my job description during my previous dozen or so years in the food industry, but with this company I was responsible for forecasting. And I'll always remember the first time I passed on a forecast to my counterpart across the hall, the director of manufacturing, and he said, okay, appreciate the forecast. I'll get this into the production plan, and this is what we're going to make for the next 2 months. And I backed off. I was horrified. I said, you shouldn't make that. That's just a forecast. So he sat me down and quickly taught me a lesson that, no, forecast is an order for product. And I've heard that from several consultants we've worked with at Oliver White. And that was an important lesson, that a forecast is not a fantasy number. It's a number that people rely on. And there are implications to your forecast. And gradually through this process, even though I was a marketing person, I got religion. In some respects, I'm the last person you would ever think of to do a webinar like this. But from the hard-won lessons at the dairy and also with working with other companies, I've seen the error of my ways, the implications of my decisions. Our forecast wasn't the only thing that was flawed. Our production planning wasn't a whole lot better. It was very reactive. It was a plan that was literally written in pencil, so we were constantly scrambling for packaging, for raw materials, producing very inefficiently. We really never thought at all about capacities until we were in trouble. So we didn't do advanced planning against our capacity. We had a tendency just to sell what we could make. You know, this is what we made last week, this is what we have to sell, so let's market that. And eventually we turned that around. We started having more of a focus to make what we could sell and sell profitably. And that was another benefit to us of the sales and operations planning process. And just one thing, last thing about the product line, it was fairly complicated in terms of the, well actually no. At our peak, we had 400 products that we marketed, and my mindset was, oh my goodness, how could anybody forecast 400 products? I didn't realize how spoiled I was at the time. It's common today for people to forecast thousands, tens of thousands of products, but that was our universe at the time, and it just seemed complicated to us. But the challenges were we had different size products, different types of products, the manufacturing processes were very different, and units of measure were different too. Some products were sold by the gallon, some products were sold by the case, some products were sold by eaches. So as part of the process, we had to come to a different unit of measure, or a common unit of measure. So here's what we did. We realized we had to do better, so we started at least what we call the sales and operations planning process. It took us a year until we actually had something that met the definition. We started with monthly meetings with mandated attendance. Even the president of the company was supposed to be there. If you missed a meeting or were more than 5 minutes late, you had to pay a $1 fine. I think we had a lunch in the company based on the fines. I don't think we ever actually collected the $1 from the company president. Spent a lot of time cleaning up our data. We had a lot of it, but it was a mess. Inventory record accuracy was not very realistic, so we started more and better cycle counting. We added more accountability to our forecasting process. We had a system. We implemented our software. I bought the software that I sell today, used it at the company. But we also had a reward structure in place where we incentivized the people doing the forecast to enhance their forecast accuracy. And it was a simple, very low-value reward system. I gave $5 each month to the person who beat the system forecast by the most. And I actually thought that no one would ever beat the system forecast. What happened was that 23 out of 24 months, someone beat the system forecast. That little bit of recognition really raised this on their priority list and had a big impact on the company. And at least at the beginning, we had a pre-sales and operations planning review of the data, where we didn't just show up to the meeting, present the data, and ask people to respond on the spot. We provided them with the input beforehand. The reason I qualified that was because it was a very manual process, and we just stopped doing it towards the end, and that really affected our process. Not for the better. Perspective was really important. One of the decisions was, what data do we need, and what's the appropriate level of detail? If you remember back to that APICS definition, it talked about managing sales and operations planning at the product family level, and that's really important. This is not down to the line item or at the SKU level. You want to aggregate your data to a meaningful level of detail. For some companies, it's by brand. For some, it's by product family. For us, it was by our bottleneck. and they were the production lines in our plant. How many ice cream sandwiches can we make? How many ice cream cones do we want to make? How many half gallons of ice cream do we expect to sell for the next year? So they were our product groupings. And then we had, I mentioned earlier on that we had different units of measure. We sold products in different units of measure. Well, capacity was expressed in one unit of measure, in production hours. We only had so many hours available in the plant per day, per shift, per month. So we converted our forecasts and our plans from either gallons or dozens or eaches to production hours. So we knew if we could run 2,000 gallons of ice cream per hour, that equated to something like 0.005 hours per gallon. And for the first time, we were able to look very objectively at the impact of how our forecast, how our plans actually stacked up against our capacity. We also had a pretty decent level of commitment and collaboration. The president was an early participant and kind of backed out early. The key was our VP of Finance and CFO. He was the guy who ran the business. He was the guy who made us accountable. And it was very clear to everyone on the S&OP team that a senior level management, number one, expected people to be in the meeting, but more importantly, to participate in the meeting, to provide their input, to make intelligent decisions based on what we talked about in the forecast, what the implications for us were in terms of capacity and what was in the production plan. And it was kind of miraculous. It was like most other companies, diverse mix of personalities in sales and marketing and operations. At the beginning, I wasn't so sure how it would work out. But because we were working towards a common goal, and because we had to turn the business around, we found that we argued pretty much as we used to, as loudly as we ever did, but it was more objectively and a whole lot more effectively. And it drove to some pretty good results. I talked about the importance of software for the process too. And this goes back a while. This was back in the late 1980s. So there was no pure S&OP software. Actually, Excel didn't even exist at the time. So I'm dating myself. And me finding this was like finding the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was kind of neat looking back. This was one of our actual S&OP spreadsheets. This was printed on a dot matrix printer. And the reason the word measure at the top looks kind of fuzzy is at the time you couldn't print in landscape mode. So we had to print 2 pages, paste them together, and this gave us our S&OP report. And one of the things that jumped out at me is that, the basic data that drives the process, and this goes back to 1988, 25 years ago, really hasn't changed a lot. The technology has changed. The ability to get the data, the ability to integrate data and collaborate certainly has changed. But the data that drives the process, there's more of it today, but it hasn't changed a whole lot. So I was intrigued. So I entered it just into Excel. Wanted to make sure the calculations all worked out and wanted to do some what-ifs in Excel. And it was really a deja vu experience. And again, this kind of data is very often the starting point for a company's basic S&OP process. You want to look at your sales information, including historical perspective. You want to look at the budget or the annual plan, similar information for the production plan, and then similar information for the inventory plan. Back then, we couldn't print color graphs. You just print a graph that had black asterisks on it. So I was really curious about what this would look like in a graph. So I just created a simple Excel graph, overlaying the forecast and the production plan against one another, and looking at the inventory against that. And no matter where you are in your S&OP process, we would encourage you, in addition to the numeric data, certainly bring data visualization into your process as well. If you have a tool that allows you to graph the data, a lot of times things will jump out at you when you look at data graphically as opposed to numerically. A couple things really jumped out just at that experience of keying that data in from that Rosetta Stone spreadsheet that I found. One was a flashback that was fun for about the first 4 rows, but I remember that the manual maintenance of S&OP data was just a nightmare. It seemed like one meeting would end, and I was the person who was responsible for maintaining the data, for maintaining the notes in the meeting. One meeting would end, and it would be time to prepare for the next month's meeting. And it was just a continual thankless process. And there are a lot of reasons why companies start on an S&OP process and fail, sometimes pretty quickly. And more often than not, it's the challenge of maintaining the data. So certainly a system will make your life a lot easier, and more importantly, make the process a whole lot more effective. So there's also a revelation when I dug into this and started doing that what if in Excel, and it was that sales and operations planning to a degree is actually a lie detector. And that's not something I'd ever thought about before. And what I mean by that, I was the card-carrying, stereotypical, very optimistic marketing person. And I mentioned my very unrealistic view of forecasting when I started off. And let's say I would come in to an S&OP meeting with, again, some objective optimism and a sense of what we could sell as opposed to what we're really going to sell. And I threw in a forecast of 500,000 units, which is the value highlighted in red towards the top of the spreadsheet. Well, ideally, you'll be using an interactive tool to run your S&OP meeting, so it's not just a static report. And when you do that, if you enter a forecast, you'll see right away the impact of that on your inventory plan. And this would be if you made no changes to the production plan. So by entering that ridiculous forecast, you can see that all of a sudden I've run the company out of inventory. If you look at a graph, you see that even more impressively or depressingly. So by having a tool that allows you to run scenarios to look at the implications of changes in the forecast, of changes in the production plan, to limitations on your capacity. Maybe it's better to say it's a truth detector, but S&OP gives you really quick and very objective feedback on the implications of your decisions. So while I was playing around, our tool has more graphs and nicer looking graphs than this, but was just looking at some of the different measures that you should consider incorporating visually in your S&OP process. Look at the forecast versus the plan in the inventory. In the upper right, you can look at the forecast versus the previous year and against the budget. If you see key variances, you realize something's either wrong with the forecast or was wrong with the budget. The lower left and the two lower graphs are capacity-oriented. You can look at the load against the capacity and ideally get some color-coded feedback as to where you're above your planned capacity, your maximum capacity, or where there's room for capacity. And that was also a key learning for us at the dairy. We talked about selling what we could make versus making what we could sell. And very objectively, each month, we would take a look at this by our production lines and see, hey, we've been overselling ice cream cones, for example. We have a lot of capacity on ice cream sandwiches. So let's promote them. Let's emphasize them in some of our sales meetings. And that really helped balance out our production. And that was another result that helped lead to our profitability. So we put together this process. We started with better data, and we had to sell. The final hurdle was we had to sell to the owner of the company that this was something that was to his benefit. And this was the message that we had to take to him. Here's how we're going to save you money, because that's what it was all about for him and our shareholders. We're going to build it. Previously, we started to build our summer inventory in April. Now we're going to start building it in February. And there was one product line, ice cream cones. We were so constrained, we had to start building the previous November. And also we're going to pay for outside storage. So we're going to build more inventory, build it earlier than ever before, and pay to store it outside our plant. And we had to do that because that area circled in yellow, as big as that is, that was our freezer space. But we still had to build more inventory than we could store there. So we paid for outside storage, and it worked. By building our inventory early, by making more of the right stuff, we had record sales. We had the best customer service in company history. We eliminated overtime. We reduced costs, and correspondingly, we increased profits. We had record profits that year. It was about a $40 million segment of the business. It was a $500,000, $500,000 turnaround for us. So it was 25 years ago. That was significant money, and that is really where I started to get religion for this. When I saw, from my own perspective, from my own participation, that the attention to detail, the objective planning, and the perspective offered by S&OP really make a meaningful impact on the business. So let's talk a little bit about some of those lessons and what they mean and how you can apply them. One interesting thing recently, we have an assessment tool on our website, demandsolutions.com, and it asks a series of questions and gives you some feedback on the supply chain assessment. And one of them was pretty basic. Do you have a formal S&OP process? And slightly more than half of the respondents said no, which was a bit of a surprise to us. This isn't a random assortment of companies. These are companies that are already involved in supply planning. And so we looked at that and looked at some research about, well, what's happened to companies that have failed, and what are some of the challenges that we face? And I work with some experienced and really talented people. One of our consultants, Christy Gieske, used to work for Oliver White. She is a consultant for Demand Solutions these days, but several years ago, she did some research into some of the challenges that companies face with S&OP. And the number one in terms of limiting their success was that there's a lot else going on. There's often competing agendas and projects. It's easy to say, yeah, this is a priority, but there are always going to be other things that get in the way. So you really have to, that's part of the reason why top management support is really critical. Some companies depend way too much on spreadsheets, and again, the task and the tedious nature of pulling together and gathering all the data required for driving an S&OP process helps make a process break down. Sometimes the data is mismanaged. Sometimes it comes in conflicting units of measure, not appropriate units of measure or levels of detail. If top management commitment isn't there, it will be very noticeable and the process will fail. And we also require commitment throughout the organization. And there's always that fight of one period's ending, another period's beginning. We need to get the financials up to date. Who has time for S&OP? So when you have a routine process and tools to help with the process, they're a lot more likely to be successful. And in terms of starting a process that would be successful, focus on the process. Again, that's more important than the software. But make sure you have a realistic process, that you have the right tools, the right data. Can't emphasize enough the importance of top-level management commitment. Invest in education and training. There's more to this than looking at YouTube videos or reading books. That's certainly a great starting point, but you can learn a lot from other companies, what they've done well, what hasn't worked so well. Invest in mentoring and consulting, people from the outside, consulting firms like Oliver White, other organizations like that who have a great deal of experience and have some great best practices that they can help you apply. And then never be content. Continually assess your process and work on action plans to continue to improve over time. So why go through all this? It is a lot of effort. It takes a lot of time. There'll be some tension at the beginning. And one of the slides that Dick Lang was kind enough to allow me to share was he had talked about S&OP objectives. And different companies do this for different reasons, but at the end of the day, even though we haven't talked about this so much to this point, we're doing this to support the customers. It's the idea is to have the right product at the right volume at the right time, the right location. We're doing that to make sure that we can run a business that meets our customers' needs. It also helps us keep an eye on the business plan. Too often that business planning process is an annual fire drill, and then companies tend to set it aside until the fire drill starts again the next year. But by routinely evaluating the progress against the plan each month, you'll do a better job of staying on the plan as well as developing next year's plan. It gives you a sense of how realistic or unrealistic your plans are, your progress against the plan. If you have scenario planning as part of your process, if you can do what-ifs, you do a much better job of managing change, which is something we can always count on. You won't be taken by surprise by capacity limitations as we were. It also helps you control costs. There's a bottom line aspect to this. It proved to us how we could minimize overtime, how we could produce our products a whole lot more profitably. We're big believers in metrics and KPIs, and S&OP in itself is a great scorecard. And just the integration of the planning and all the different people involved, it really does build teamwork within an organization. And the end result of S&OP, what it will do for you, it gives you, again, much better plans. I remember Dick was at one of our meetings years ago, and he talked about how well do you do anything that you only do once a year? He talked about going skiing once a year. And for most companies, this business planning process is a once-a-year event. And in S&OP, you're continually refining the plan each month. So when it comes time to do next year's budget, next year's plan, you already have a pretty good start to the plan in place. You'll be tracking your performance against objectives. You'll be able to be less reactive and respond more flexibly to opportunities in the marketplace. A whole lot more likely to make what you can sell versus selling what you can make. The improved performance is guaranteed to give you better credibility with your customers. The impact on customer service, on product availability, is going to hit your bottom line. It's also, people will get used to the data and rely on the data. That's part of the S&OP process, part of the reports, part of the presentation, and they'll also make much better use of the data that they're given and their time applied to the process. And the last thing is one that I added. Anytime I was in a position, either evaluating marketing, evaluating new software, evaluating process, one of the first questions I asked was, how would I feel if a competitor did this? And if I have a successful S&OP process, and I know one of my key competitors doesn't, I know I'm going to do a better job. And also I know how I feel if they had it and I didn't. So it really can be a competitive weapon for you. In terms of getting started, first question to ask yourself, what do you want the S&OP process to do for you? Is it, do you have capacity issues? Do you have customer service issues? And then we'll start to build the process based on achieving your goals. Don't do it all yourself. Look for some guidance and perspective from some third parties. Keep it simple and keep it small to start. It will build over time, but you want to have some early victories. Talked about the importance of data and the likelihood that a lot of us will underestimate the data requirements. It's a lot of data, budgets, forecasts, production plans, capacity plans, and map that out based on the goals that you want to achieve. Ideally, I started with the spreadsheet. A lot of people are going to start with the spreadsheet, but there's software like ours out there that makes the data integration, makes the scenario planning, the what-ifs a whole lot simpler. And then, as I mentioned earlier, don't let up. Continually expand and critique your process as you go forward. And eventually, you'll get a set of data that will help you make decisions, based on the perspective it provides. And typically, there's more than one presentation of the data. In addition to that classic sales and operations and inventory view, you can take a look at the impact of changes in the plans and your capacity. Talk a little bit about IBP, integrated business planning, and whether or not it's a thing. Is it real? Is there an advantage to IBP beyond sales and operations planning? And I think there is. It depends on you. There's some fine differences between IBP and S&OP. For one thing, real S&OP, successful sales and operations planning, has always been an integrated process. So the integration is not all that new. Some of what's being promoted as part of IBP, which really helps you extend the effectiveness of your S&OP process. There's more of an interface with the external environment. There's more involvement with your customers and your suppliers in terms of collaboration. There are more KPIs and dashboards. It's not so much, it's still very much a presentation of the data, but it's also keeping score and tracking your progress over time. A much higher, not that this was never there before, even way back when in Lotus 1, 2, 3, we would look at our plans in dollars as well as units, but financial integration is a key part of IBP. There's a tendency to look out beyond the next 12 months, out 2 years, and more of an integration between the aggregate and the detailed levels of planning. Talked about beginning this journey, that this was a journey, and that the start of it for me was at that Costco, which was on the grounds where that ice cream plant, the Penn-Dairies, used to exist. And in thinking about this and working on this webinar, it really came full circle. It's still, every time I drive into that parking lot, I twinge a little bit, kind of miss the fact that that dairy is no longer there. But also, when I walk in the door of Costco, no matter what aisle I go down, the food aisle, the apparel aisle, the hardware aisle, I see products on the shelf that we've worked with on sales and operations planning. So even though the dairy where I started, S&OP, is no longer there, I can go on that same piece of land into a different building, and I can see the impact still of sales and operations planning. S&OP is not the only reason that these companies have their products on the shelves or keep them on the shelves, but it certainly helps do so very effectively and very efficiently and profitably. Last revisit of the definition of S&OP, and this is subtle, but I think it's profound. And this was another quote, the last quote from Dick Lang, that at the end of the day, S&OP is the process that allows management to gain control of the business. It's the data, it's the process, and it gives you an objective feel and more control in the business. Some resources I'll point you to, and again, as Matt mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, we'll make this entire presentation available to you. Dick Lang is still going at it. Unfortunately, his former business partner, his more recent business partner, passed away, Andy Caldrick, but you can reach Dick through his website. Oliver White is a great source of information and consulting on S&OP. APEX, the IBF, Institute of Business Planning, and actually APEX and IBF collaborate themselves on some S&OP best practices. And certainly our company, please, if you've never been there, visit our website. What happens when you get there? And you'll see a link for a resource center at the top. Click on that. You'll see a drop-down that will take you to a bunch of different white papers. One of the things you can also get is a checklist on where to start with an S&OP process, what to keep in mind for the S&OP process. And I'll skip through these real quickly. These are just some of the white papers that are out. There's an ebook on forecasting on the website. And I'll put my contact information in just a second. Please feel free to contact me directly if you have any questions, if you'd like more information. I write periodically on LinkedIn and on Twitter, so if you're interested in more information about forecasting, supply chain, S&OP, that's where you can find it. Again, my contact information is at the bottom of this screen. And Matt, I think this is, when I turn it back to you.
Yeah, we have about 7 or 8 minutes. I have quite a few questions here for you, Bill, and because we do have so many, I'll just try to go through them as quickly as I can. Take as much time as you like. Have some good ones. The first one from Sean, I'm trying to sell our management on the value of S&OP. Any ideas for what I can tell them about how this will impact our company?
Great question. It's a mix of tangibles and intangibles. I mean, we talked about the improvement in performance versus objective. I kind of almost closed with a spiel on improving credibility with your customers. And the bottom line is you'll have a better bottom line, no pun intended, but you'll plan more objectively, more profitably, and more realistically, and make much better use of your data and your manpower.
This one obviously varies from industry to industry, whatever you're doing. Comes from Jamie. How long does it take to successfully implement S&OP?
I like that. It depends on the degree on your starting point. If you have a very active and effective forecasting and supply planning process, you probably have most of the data that you need to drive an S&OP process. So if the data is there and if you have a tool where you're able to consolidate it and aggregate it to a meaningful level of detail, you can have the data presented in a month, maybe 2 months, but what really takes time is the process itself. It's getting people to collaborate, to work together. It's helpful to go through 3 to 6 cycles. So between the data, so you can be started in 2 to 3 months and have an effective process in 6 to 9 months is pretty much our experience.
Next question, and if you're on the line, I apologize, I'll probably mispronounce your name, from Zeneda. Does anyone use fiscal calendars for MRP or for S&OP?
I'd imagine that is what Sunita is referring to is like a 5-4-4 versus, or 4-4-5 calendar versus the Julian calendar. And that's actually the norm. It seems like more companies have those types of fiscal calendars, and that it's not uncommon at all. And an interesting thing with a calendar like that, I used the phrase earlier, self-inflicted seasonality. Those 5-period months often show up as seasonal spikes in your history and your forecast and in your plan. So there's no problem with that as long as you're consistent. If what you call December is always a 5-week month from year to year, then you're fine. It's not uncommon at all.
Next question for you, Bill, comes from Susan. Is there a certain function that should own the S&OP process, sales, marketing, or product supply?
I have a bias. It's certainly coming from marketing. I'm more in sales now, but I do feel that marketing especially, that marketing should own the process. Marketing typically will make the biggest impact on the process. Years ago at one of our customer conferences, George Palmatier, who's also wrote some great books and great white papers, he also works for the Oliver White organization, had a quote that it's the role of the sales force and the marketing team to distort the forecast. No matter which way sales are heading, it's up to us to turn them around and have them heading up more sharply. And if you're not getting input and there's not accountability for sales and marketing, then someone else is trying to make decisions based on input that they don't control. That being said, my experience in the last 25 years, it's all too rare. It happens, but it's disappointingly rare for sales and marketing to be that active a participant in the process. When it happens, it's wonderful, but there can be more exciting, seemingly more fun things, seemingly more important things than participating in the process. But at the end of the day, having the right product and running a business profitably, there's not much more that's more important than that. So I would encourage sales and marketing to run the process.
Have time here for probably one or two more. This one comes from Dana. Are there any prerequisite processes that a company needs to have before launching S&OP?
Very basically, the two prerequisites would be a demand planning or forecasting process, because obviously the forecast has a huge impact on future demand and then eventually on future supply, and also a supply planning process. So you need to factor in your inventories, your lead times, your minimum order quantities, your minimum production quantities, and then what S&OP does is it meshes them together into an integrated plan. So I can't imagine starting or having an S&OP process without those two prerequisite processes.
And looks like the last one we have time for today is from David. Pretty broad here, but what level of detail is best in S&OP?
I'm on the line. I'm thinking. It varies so much by company. And I've read, I think in Dick Lang's book, he suggests that you should have no more than 12 product families for your S&OP process. And the reason for that, the magic isn't specifically in the number 12, but it's that you have a manageable number of families that you can analyze individually and look at different scenarios and look at implications. If you had hundreds of families, the meeting would run all day or all week. So very often our starting point is we'll tell a company start with 10 to 12 to 15 families. Sometimes it gets up to about 24, but start with that idea in mind, a handful of families, but even more important than that is that it's a meaningful level of detail. Sometimes it's for us it was by work center, by product type. That was our bottleneck. For some companies, it's by channel. For some companies, it's by brand. So we're happy to respond to the specific needs and interests of any specific company, and there'll be a different right answer for each company, for each industry.
Excellent.
Hopefully that answers Dave's question.
Unfortunately, that is all the time we have on questions today. Bill, thank you again. As a reminder, this presentation, Sales and Operation Planning, A Journey from Chaos to Prosperity, will be available on the Industry Week website, industryweek.com or iw.com, in the next few days. Log in again if you want to view it again, or share it with friends, colleagues, anybody who you think would benefit from it, or anybody you think just wants ice cream, because now I want ice cream. So hope everybody enjoyed it. Thanks for your attendance. Bill, thanks very much.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks, everyone. Really do appreciate you taking your time.